Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. This is the Mind the Gap, the first class of three. Today we're just going to be talking about understanding the gap and how it all works. Just a brief introduction. My name's Ian. Glad to see you guys all here today. My wife and I are a neurodiverse couple. Okay, I'm Asperger's, so I'm on the autism spectrum, and I also have some strong ADHD elements. And we've been on this journey of navigating the challenges and the joys that come with a relationship like ours for years now, right? We've had our ups and downs. There's times where we completely miss each other. Like we're both talking almost like we're different languages and we're both speaking English, but it's like different languages entirely. And then we've also had times and moments where the connection is really deep and it just makes it all worth it. Anyway, what we're doing is we're teaching you guys this because we've realized that through the struggles there is a lot of connection that can come, and it's perfectly fine for there to be struggles, right? The idea is that there's a reality that there will be struggles, and then we just continue to move forward together, right? So we've had a lot of experience like this, and wanted to turn around and help other people with this. Um, uh, what we've noticed is that we want to better understand each other's differences. That's what we do in our marriages, generally, but more so for neurotypicals. So we want to find ways to connect even when it feels impossible. And the more often this feels impossible, or the more we avoid it, the more likely the marriage then takes a hit. And the desire for connection decreases, and it puts the marriage at risk of falling into a space where neither partner cares enough to work through the challenges. Kind of this negative feedback loop. It just gets worse and worse over time. But by the end of our time together, both this class and the other two, I hope you feel heard and understood and more hopeful about how you can grow together and get the right support for both of you as individuals and as a neurodiverse couple. So we're going to get started. So as I said earlier, this is the first in a series of three classes. We'll be doing the next two Saturdays. We're going to be talking in addition to this. Today is about the understanding the gap. Next week it's going to be talking more specifically about how to bridge the gap, and then the third is how to repair the bridge, or when there's conflict, how do you work through the struggles and the arguments themselves. And we are designing the classes so that you don't have to attend one of the classes to get the other two. So if someone you know has missed today and they couldn't come, they can still come to the next two, and that's totally fine. We'll do a brief recap for relevant stuff, but then each class will stand on their own, even though it's designed as a series. So anyway, feel free to pass along the information to anybody else that you feel could come, even if they couldn't make it today. So after I'm done teaching, then we'll open it up for more Q&A, and you guys are welcome to talk about more of your individual struggles, and we'll kind of work through it with you and help you move forward. All right. So today we're going to be just kind of running over these basic concepts, talking about neurodiversity in relationships, the traits and impact of neurodiversity, emotional intimacy in neurodiverse marriages, key aspects of communication, identifying and bridging the gaps, overcoming barriers to intimacy, and then building a shared linked language. These are the general concepts we're going to be covering. All right, so let's talk about the neurodivergent brain, okay? So neurodivergence broadly is referring to physical differences in brain structure and the neuronal activities that distinguish neurodivergent individuals from those that are considered neurotypical, okay? A common misconception is that if a neurodivergent person just knows better, they should be able to act more effectively. That's not true, okay? Because the brain is literally physically wired differently, or has different physical differences, size differences, or whatever. And so it is a literal hardwire thing that there are certain aspects that can be worked on and improved over time, but it's not something that, if you just know the right thing to say or do, it's just done. So it is no different from any other physiological aspect that can't just be overcome in an instant. Okay. But we're going to approach neurodiversity and neurodivergence and neurotypical people without deeming either one as wrong or superior. We're going to honestly acknowledge each person's unique nature and accept the impact these differences have on one another due to the varied ways our brains function. Now, there's many types of neurodivergence out there, way too many to focus on in this class series. So we're going to be spending our time here mainly discussing autism and Asperger's and then ADHD, but there are other types of neurodivergence, and if you guys are wrestling with one of those, feel free to pitch out some questions. You are free, by the way, to ask questions in the chat. And then my wife, Carol, will help handle those questions. We'll deal with that in the Q&A at the end. But that way, if you have a question, you don't want to forget it, you're welcome to stick it in the chat, and then she'll gather those, and then we'll do it during the Q&A. So, all right. So, with the understanding that neurodiversity is not wrong or right, and neurotypicality is not wrong or right either, we want to focus on the realities that are faced in the relationships that are navigating neurodiversity. So, the blending of neurodivergent and neurotypical ways of living and socializing. Now, there's different methods of connection that bring their own strengths and challenges. For example, ADHD and people with that can introduce a creativity, an energy, a spontaneity, while autism spectrum conditions can offer strong logical thinking. And female Asperger's and autism have a slightly different manifestation, but they also bring their own strengths to a neurodiverse marriage. Anyway, so neurotypical partners often contribute empathy and social awareness, aiding in the building of those emotional bonds. So while these traits can sometimes make connecting more difficult, they also open doors for growth in profoundly rewarding ways. So it is completely okay if you find it challenging to understand your partner's neurodivergence. It's not even just an understanding, okay? Because let's be honest, let's be real, is that this can get really, really painful and really difficult because these gaps seem like they're a mile wide. And I promise that Carol and I have had our own share of arguments and struggles and all of these in trying to recognize and bridge between this gap that happens between a neurotypical and a neurodivergent. So we're not here to pretend that, oh, it should be easy. Let's just give you the information and you guys will be able to navigate this. No, it's hard and it's really painful. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done, and it doesn't mean that it's not rewarding at the end, okay? The goal here isn't to change you, but to help you learn how to connect in a way that works for both of you within a marriage. So we're going to talk about understanding some of our differences. Okay. So I mentioned earlier, so ADHD, people with that, they tend to bring more energy and creativity and excitement, but it also makes it tough for them to stay focused or be fully responsive. For anybody that's been around someone with ADHD, you can be having like a really serious, important conversation and they're off somewhere else. They're in the middle of it, so all of a sudden their brain goes, they have another thought, and they follow that direction. It just derails the whole conversation, right? So that can be a real struggle when you're trying to get some of these deeper connections. When you're ASD or Asperger's, they tend to be really good with direct logical communication without a lot of subtext, right? Usually what an Asperger's or autistic person says, they mean taken at face value, okay? So they don't do nuance, they don't do a lot of these subtleties and stuff. What they say is what they mean, and you can take it directly at face value, okay? But that also they struggle with picking up on those nuances and subtext that are loaded into neurotypical conversations, which often leads to misunderstandings. Then finally, neurotypicals are really good at picking up on the social cues, and that helps with their empathy, but they also can overthink when met with the type of communication that ADHD or ASD or Asperger's bring to the table. So just in the communication, there's these gaps between how people handle stuff and are able to move forward. So every partner brings something valuable, okay? Whether it's logic, empathy, spontaneity, or a number of other traits. We're vastly oversimplifying here, but these are just examples. Is that both on an individual case, like as I've heard once, if you've met one Asperger's person, you've met one Asperger's person. We're all different, right? Even though we have similar traits, we're all still vastly different. So each individual is going to have their own strengths to bring to the table, as well as strengths that come from our general neuro category, right? Neurotypical, autism, ADHD, or any of the others. So in a neurodiverse marriage, traditional ways of communicating don't always work. But when you figure out what does work, then you can create a very unique but powerful connection. So the whole key, in fact, this is going to be a theme across all three classes, okay, is the idea of emotional intimacy. If you want to boil down what the core issue is, all the other gaps in a neurodiverse marriage, they all are problematic because people feel as though emotional intimacy is missing. It's what makes us feel seen, understood, and supported, right? It is this deep connection that makes you feel like you're not alone in something. It removes the isolation. It helps you feel like you're in a real partnership. Okay. Physical intimacy only leads to and feeds from emotional intimacy. Physical intimacy without the emotional intimacy is kind of empty, honestly, right? But it can, if emotional intimacy isn't present and it's being actively built, then physical intimacy assists with that. But emotional intimacy is the core. And so when people feel that they are struggling in a neurodiverse relationship, it is because there's problems with emotional intimacy. Okay, so everything we're talking about here is going to have this theme, and we're going to be focusing on emotional intimacy quite a bit throughout these three classes. All right, so traits like ADHD and Asperger's can make emotional connection far more challenging. Okay, as I mentioned before, like you can have be having a serious, important conversation with someone with ADHD, and all of a sudden their brain is gone. They can't even pull it together. It's actually painful and difficult for them, exhausting to actually stay in a conversation for a long time. Asperger's can have the same kind of thing. Sometimes it's really hard for them to stay in a conversation, depending on how strongly autistic they are. Some of them have trouble making eye contact. Some of them can't deal with strong emotions. They certainly have a hard time reading emotional signals, subtleties, and subtext in conversations. So it is a challenge, but recognizing the challenges is the first step to overcoming them. Okay. And again, let's be clear, overcoming them doesn't mean that they learn how to stop being neurodiverse. That it's not going to happen. There are some medications that can help with ADHD. It doesn't completely change it completely, but there's a limited amount of medical help for autism and Asperger's. Largely, we have to learn just how to adjust and adapt the way we approach life and move forward. But recognizing those challenges is the way to help us create these adaptive formulas and methods to assist in the connection. But it isn't just a matter of, oh, well, I'm just no longer Asperger's, I'm no longer ADHD. That's not really a thing. It's about coming up with unique paths to overcoming this in your individual marriage. All right, so one of the basic concepts is this idea called linked language. Okay, we often find it easiest to communicate with people who are like us. All right, neurodivergent people understand each other more naturally. I have friends of mine who are Asperger's, and guess what? We don't have communication issues. Okay, we talk, we connect, we understand all the unspoken language rules that we have for each other. I've got a friend of mine I've been talking to recently about some of this stuff, as Carol and I have been really diving into this and grasping a lot more of our own experience. And he and I sat down and kind of identified a bunch of the language rules that he and I both follow. We've never had to talk about them. We just instinctively understood them. Okay. But I don't instinctively understand neurotypical conversation. I don't, because I don't have the linked language. I don't understand the verbal and nonverbal communication that just, neurotypicals typically share, okay? But Asperger's and autistic people share their own language. So you have this gap between the two groups, but both groups do understand within their own group pretty well, right? And there's variation on individuals, of course, okay? But with neurodiverse relationships, you have to intentionally build a shared language. It takes more time and effort, but it affects your emotional connection. When the linked language begins to start to come in, then you start to understand and find that emotional intimacy. All right. But because it doesn't exist easily between neurodiverse and neurotypical groups, neurodiverse marriages struggle to find emotional intimacy, which makes each partner feel isolated and alone. Okay. It's really easy to compare. I've done this with Carol, by the way, as I've said, well, my friends that I talk to, like these friends, they get this and this works just fine. So why can't you do it? Right. But it doesn't work like that, right? She can't just start being an Asperger's and start talk like an Asperger. She's neurotypical. So it's not fair for me to put that on her, nor is it fair to put that on me. We can't talk like each other, but we can develop a linked language that lets us start to bridge this gap and then start to find some of these connections. So we call these neuroaffective approaches, okay? These are approaches specifically designed for neurodiverse couples that are helping them to connect more effectively. Instead of relying on typical methods that might not fit, neuroaffective approaches focus on understanding each partner's unique brains and then using that understanding to improve connections. So the whole goal is to move towards connection, recognizing that this connection, the emotional intimacy is missing and the linked language gaps are there. Then we start taking active steps towards that direction to create a place where we build more of these connections. So let's start to really understand the gap between neurodiverse people and neurotypical individuals in a marriage. Okay, to do this, we're going to discuss three core elements within a marriage. The first is communication, okay? There's different styles of communication. So neurodivergent partners often value directness, while neurotypical partners rely on hints and subtlety. These different styles can lead to misunderstandings really easily and make it difficult to develop a linked language. Without it, it's easy to feel disconnected and exhausted from trying to communicate effectively. But when you work on shared experiences, it can help turn these differences into a source of closeness. So misinterpreting cues, which is really easy. Like I said, like neurotypicals are typically framed as though they understand the emotional cues better. They catch the social cues. They only catch the social cues within a neurotypical world. Okay. They don't understand the social cues in a neurodiverse world. They're just as blind to the neurodiverse social cues as the neurodiverses are blind to neurotypical cues. Okay. So, but recognizing that that gap is there, we understand that these things happen often. And so being direct and honest can help bridge the gaps. Okay. And it makes it easier to understand each other over time. Basically, when you stop beating your heads against each other saying, but you should understand this, you should understand this, you should understand this. You don't. You have to step back and say, okay, they're not going to understand me the way I'm presenting naturally. We need to work on something for us. And that's what we're talking about here. Now, the other two core elements are conflict resolution and problem solving. Conflict resolution between yourselves, where you're having a conflict and you try to work out how to work through the conflict, right? Unfortunately, when you have this gap between the neurodiverse and the neurotypical, I mean, within your own group, these can be difficult, okay? But when you have the added gap of neurodiverse and neurotypical, then you can walk away from a genuine attempt to work through an issue, work through a conflict, and it's just blown up even more and gotten worse because of the communication gap between the two groups, okay? So conflict resolution is a huge part of a marriage, and then the other part is the problem solving. Okay, this is where you are working together to try to solve, like, well, we've got this problem with our kid, right? They're saying or doing this to their siblings, or they're having trouble with school, or whatever it is, or we've got a budget problem, or we've got, I mean, there's so many different things. Like coming together to solve problems together is a whole nother skill set. It's a core part of any marriage, right? So basic communication, conflict resolution, and problem solving. These three areas are everything else sort of flows into them, right? If these three areas are breaking down, the emotional intimacy is gone. You don't feel close to each other because you can't work on these areas. So When you're dealing with conflict resolution and problem solving, the neurodiverse partners tend to prefer logic or direct solutions. Neurotypical partners seek emotional support or focus on the journey. These different approaches can create gaps that then make conflict resolution and problem solving tough. Okay. A lot of time and energy can be spent just trying to understand where the other person is coming from. So, to address this, the neuroaffective approaches help build the linked language. Then that allows both partners to feel heard and solve problems together more effectively. Okay. Your willingness to understand each other and find common ground is representative of the dedication to the relationship. Without that dedication, you're going to get nowhere. And then neurodivergent partners often want straightforward solutions to problems, whereas a lot of neurotypical partners need a lot of emotional processing first. This is not universal. Neurodivergents have emotions too, and sometimes need to emotionally process stuff first. But how they process and the order in which they process is very, very different from from neurotypicals. So this language barrier can make problem solving feel absolutely overwhelming. Okay. And Carol and I have absolutely felt this when we've tried to tackle problems. Frequently, the language barrier feels so bad. I'll tell you, this is not the first time we've tried to create classes. We've tried to work on classes before, and I can tell you, just working together to create a class has been almost an overwhelming problem for the two of us, because we finally just in the creation of this class, we pinned down some of the areas, and this is a neuroaffective solution that's like, oh, when you say this, this is what you mean because I'm doing this thing over here, but we didn't have the language to be able to understand it at first. So when we build our linked language, it helped us navigate creating a class where one of us or both of us didn't walk away completely frustrated, throw our hands in like, fine, you just do it. I'm not going to do it. You do it. Right? This is normal in a marriage to have these kinds of things, but it was the linked language that allowed us to come together, figure out how to move forward, and now feel emotionally intimate in the experience. All right, so let's talk about some of the gaps, okay? The core areas we just talked about are struggles because of the gaps in many other areas between the neurotypicals and the neurodiverse, okay? So this includes, for example, something I call the apperception gap. Apperception, it's the word perception with the letters AP in the beginning, so apperception. It is the process of how we perceive the world around us, then comprehend it, and then interpret it in a way that helps us bring that information into our worldview and make it a workable thing, okay? The way we see the world is so completely different. The way we see the world and then interpret it and comprehend it is so completely different that it is one of the foundational gaps that makes it difficult then to communicate, problem solve, and resolve conflict. And so, for example, right? So as an Aspie, Carol and I talked about this, like I have essentially goggles on, right? I'm hyper focused on the thing in front of me. I do not have peripheral vision. Okay, I don't. And this is both physical. I mean, I have peripheral vision, but it doesn't process. Okay, so we've lived in this town for 8 years. And there is a grocery store that we go to regularly. I had lived here 7 years, gone to the store 1,000 times. I mean, I don't know how many times. Like we're there all the time because that's our main grocery store. And one day, all of a sudden, I was like, wait a minute, there's this little shop right across the street. It looks old. How long has it been there? And she looks at me. She says, it's been there ever since we've moved here, like probably 20 years before we got here. I'm like, I've never noticed it before. Okay. I've never noticed it because I have hyper focus. I'm focused on the grocery store. And so because I'm focused on the grocery store, I literally don't process anything else in my peripheral vision. I mean, was it there in my peripheral vision? Yes. Did my brain process it? Absolutely not. It wasn't until one day I happened to look and was looking straight at it, and then my eyes focused and I'm like, oh, that's it. I've never seen this before. It's been there the whole time, right? That's an apperception gap, and that's a real thing. That's just physical, right? We're not even talking about the way we perceive emotions or situations, solutions. Because of this apperception gap, it drives a lot of other stuff. I mentioned earlier, there's physiological changes. For example, the amygdala size in the brain is larger for Asperger's males, not females, but males, than it is for neurotypical people. The amygdala is what handles a lot of the anxiety responses. So an enlarged amygdala means we go to anxiety responses way more quickly than other people and sometimes more intensely. That's a hardwire physiological thing. I have anxiety. I've worked through some of it. I still have anxious responses and it causes problems, but it's hardwired. All I can do is work on learning how to calm and soothe myself down so I don't go into that space. Okay. The cerebellum and the corpus callosum, which handle a lot of the rational thinking in the brain, they're structured differently in Asperger's females. They don't have an enlarged amygdala, but the cerebellum and corpus callosum are structured differently. So the way their thoughts work is processed differently. ADHD people have smaller prefrontal cortexes, which is where a lot of the conscious rational thought takes place right here, and the connection is different. Then so there are actual physiological gaps between the neurotypical and these other people. So there's a communication gap. Okay, so for example, Carol and I have been talking recently that for an Aspie male versus a neurotypical female, we have a bumper car versus a lazy river type of communication style, right? So as an Aspie male, I have an opinion, okay? And I have lots of evidence to back up this opinion. I'm totally willing to reevaluate my opinion, okay? But it's like bumper cars. We hit each other. This is like my Asperger's friends. This is how we approach each other. It's like, whoa, this is how I feel. This is how I feel. Bam, and we hit each other. We're not arguing. There's no fight. There's nothing. But it's like we're taking the weight of our evidence and we hit each other with it. And then in that conflict, I call it conflict. We're not fighting, right? But in the compare contrast of our evidence, we both come out like, oh, I just learned something new. That's cool. I'm going to adjust the way I approach things. But we bring this weight because we're like, this is how I feel, and I have evidence and reasons for how I feel that way. But let's hit each other and see what we come up with. It's bumper cars, okay? Asperger's, non-Asperger's, neurotypicals are more on the lazy river. They're going to explore. They're kind of floating along like, hey, let's go explore this. I don't know. I don't know if this is right or wrong. Let's go find out. And so when you have a bumper car hit someone on a lazy river, boom, the lazy river person gets upended and suddenly the conversation is over because they're like, look, I'm just exploring. You just hit me and knocked me over. There's nothing more to say. We're done. Okay. And Asperger's male scratches heads like, wait, I'm just doing this is how we explore. I'm exploring with you. Why did this not work? So that's just an example of the kind of communication gap that exists. Like people with ADHD, they tend to have a ton of scattered parenthetical comments that derail conversations. All right. Communication gap. Okay. These are real things, but they all contribute to communication, problem solving, and conflict resolution issues within a marriage, okay? Which then, with problems with those, now means that there's emotional intimacy problems. You see how this all kind of flows together? So with these gaps, then, the goal is, I can't change my amygdala size. I can't do it, okay? I suspect that surgery wouldn't solve the problem. But what we do is we find ways to compensate for these things. So we want to overcome these barriers to intimacy. Now, here's something I want to mention, okay? And there's something called Cassandra syndrome, and this is for spouses of a neurodivergent, usually Asperger's autistic, okay? They can often feel unheard or alone. The Asperger's or autistic person, they're so on their bumper car that the other person gets constantly flipped over on their lazy river. So they're not listened to. They can't bring the proper evidence to the table to convince the neurodiverse person that they're right or wrong. And so therefore the communication style continues. And then the person with Cassandra syndrome now feels completely isolated, like they're never believed, there's no connection. It's very painful and very difficult, okay? Now, it's really crucial to recognize that you have these feelings without placing blame. It's your fault I feel this way. The neurodiverse person is not doing it on purpose. They're hardwired, right? And so if you feel this way, recognize that you're not alone in this, but you want to now work towards finding a better way to overcome those gaps. You can achieve emotional intimacy, And then you want to work on creating that linked language. Okay. It takes time. It is challenging. It can be painful, but it is possible with patience and effort. Once you build that linked language, it helps you understand each other more easily. Okay. And then as you are willing to create the shared understanding, it becomes incredibly valuable to your relationship. So that's mostly it for today. We're talking a lot about the gap, but moving forward, I want to be really clear. The challenges you face are real. By being relatively general in the class, I am not minimizing, nor am I what is it? So overgeneralizing that it makes it like it's not relevant for these challenges. Like they are painful, they're hard, but they're also opportunities for growth. It's not about fixing the other person, making a neurotypical person more like you as a neurodiverse, or making a neurodiverse person more neurotypical. It doesn't work that way, but it's learning about working with each other's strengths. So today's just the beginning. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to explore more concrete tools and strategies to help you build intimacy while respecting each other as individuals. So next week, we're going to talk about building the communication bridge between each other, how to build the link language, some of these neuroaffective techniques. And then the week after, we're going to talk about conflict resolution and problem solving more, about how to repair the bridge when things are difficult. But working together, you'll be able to build a stronger, more loving relationship. All right, that's the class, y'all. So now, if you got questions, let's hear them.